How can forecasting help you scale user acquisition? Hello, and welcome to Growth Masterminds, the podcast for growth marketers. My name is John Koetsier. There comes a time in an app or game's life cycle, hopefully, when you're ready to scale. You think you have product market fit, you're retaining early cohorts, you're monetizing them. Now it's about growth. How can forecasting help? To chat, we have Nathan Ceulemans. He's been an exec at Leanplum, which was since acquired by CleverTap. He was at SensorTower, which everybody knows, and is currently at Kohort, where his LinkedIn tagline is min-maxing game profitability with neural network powered LTV forecasting. Wow, that's a mouthful. Welcome, Nathan.
Thank you. It is definitely a mouthful. And in fact, I'm constantly tweaking, so I'm always open for suggestions. No, it is exactly that. Min-maxing is a great way to put it. I like to draw back to my old World of Warcraft days of trying to get everything exactly right down to the perfect meta. But that is exactly what it is. When you have a scaling game, you have a game that is ready to scale up. You typically already have your monetization and retention metrics in some way, shape, or form ready for prime time, for the global launch. And ultimately, you want to plan out for how you're going to scale it up, because you don't necessarily want to just leave everything up to luck. So whether that is deciding between your different UA networks, what sort of campaigns to run, what sort of creatives to run, that's typically the first starting point for it, is what sort of user acquisition are we going to run? But down to the nitty gritty of it, you have to understand what sort of financials go into this and what sort of capital then needs to be poured into user acquisition and what the ROI is going to be of further improvements to product. And that's where forecasting comes to play.
Yeah, I noticed on the website you said there's another tagline: "We predict the future." There is. You guys are not shy, which is great. This is wonderful. But I also noticed that Russell Ovens, who I had on Growth Masterminds, it's got to be half a year ago by now, who has written the book "Game Analytics, Retention, and Monetization in a Free-to-Play Mobile Game." In free-to-play mobile games, he's given you, quite the shout out and said, "Hey, this is where you go after you've learned everything in my book." That's pretty impressive. Let's dive into it. How do you forecast retention? How do you forecast monetization? What's the process?
So actually, for a great primer on that note, actually refer to Russell Ovens' Game Analytics book. Honestly, it goes through all of the different steps along the way to drawing up, what sort of queries in SQL you have to be SQL, you have to actually be doing in order to get your monetization retention forecast up. There are various ways to do it, and they are from the simplest to the most complex, essentially an extrapolation of historic current behavior. And so what goes into that is you need to have enough historic current behavior to base on, or you can draw some conservative estimates from benchmarks of comparable games, competitors, et cetera, if you have access to the data. Now, where we've actually ended up after years of tweaking how we forecast monetization and retention is actually with a neural network powered model. And what that does is actually look at previous patterns and trends, essentially behavioral characteristics in monetization and retention for every individual segment. So UA networks typically, but also campaigns and campaign types, and draw from those to ensure for more data core segments. So new cohorts, for instance, what sort of retention are you expecting? Because statistical regression can be used to go and extrapolate retention and monetization for a forecast into the future. But at a certain point, it becomes a pretty big load to compute that for every segment you're running, for every cohort that is coming in day by day.
Mm-hmm. Does that mean your future UA, you need to try and get some of the cohorts that you've gotten that have been very, very successful? You need to kind of replicate that in the future?
Exactly. And there's a certain level of weighting you should do and always be aware of when you look at your most successful cohorts, because what happens with scaling UA spend, and this is network per network and even campaign type per campaign type, is every spend pattern has its own price volume curve. And that is initially when you start spending on a new network, you're going to see that you're in what they call the golden cohorts. Essentially, there's a great analogy to put it in. If you look at a field of apple trees, you've got your low hanging fruit, very easy to reach, but there is more fruit on those trees. So the incremental cost then of reaching that higher fruit in those trees And so those users past your golden cohorts is only going to be higher and higher. So at a certain point, your CPIs will start to take off. Your new user, your incremental new user essentially becomes slightly more expensive to get. And at what point does that then mean that you should scale back because you potentially have a scaling opportunity on another network or another campaign type? Therein lies the crux of the issue. That is the balancing between different media mixes that UA managers need to do day to day.
That's a core challenge, right? Because you often see that in games and apps. You see that, hey, we can grow and we're successful and this is great. And then you kind of hit a wall. And that wall is where you've got that low hanging fruit. And now you need to overspend in your mind. You need to, and maybe overspend in terms of your monetization mechanic as well, right? In terms of how much LTV ROAS you're getting from people. And now it's really more challenging, and that happens on a lot of different levels. That can happen per partner, that can happen per channel, that can happen just, we're trying everything right now, and now we need to get out of like just in-app advertising and move maybe to CTV or something like that, or try other things entirely, because we're maxing out right here. That's a challenging thing to hit and then diagnose properly and then actually prescribe a solution for.
Yeah, and not every game is made the same, right? A lot of the trial by fire for games comes in those early CPI and ROAS tests and UA campaigns, and that initial sort of spend to figure out, are we in a range of CPIs where the LTV will potentially back out for these users that we're going to acquire? And in that moment, a lot of games are killed on the spot. It's an unfortunate reality, but it won't have conceivable legs to scale up further. And a lot of the initial testing is then based, sadly, on just retention. So do we have the retention curve for this game to potentially build out monetization on top of it? But the assumption that's made in doing so, and again, this comes right back to not every game is the same, but not every LTV curve is the same, is that once you start to layer in monetization, you are doing so at a severe cost of your retention. So then there's a balancing act of retention and monetization that only proves itself in the LTV curve resulting. Yeah.
That's interesting. And one of the things that you mentioned to me as we were prepping this via email is, hey, product teams need to forecast together with UA teams. And I want to dive into that because it's a great segue from where you just were, because, some teams are building a game and then they tack on monetization. And some of the people that I've talked to recently that are the absolute experts at monetization are saying, hey, never do that. It needs to be built into your mechanic. It needs to be native and fully integrated into what you're doing, so that there's a bunch of reasons for that. One, it's natural, it's normal, it's expected, it's part of the experience. Two, as you get your early cohorts in, they have the same monetization things going on in their experience of your game or app as later cohorts do. So you're going to be more predictive about future success.
Absolutely. And I find it funny. I've come across numerous product teams that will look at me like I'm a crazy man when I tell them like, hey, you should think about actually trying to predict, or at least putting some sort of estimate number on what sort of uplifts your game updates are going to bring months down the line. And the reason for that reluctance is typically sometimes a game update, no matter how inconsequential it might seem, just has completely outsized effects. And the examples are too many to count. But where the pain of that reluctance really comes and bears and rears its ugly head is in the matter that you can't then allocate a budget to a product team without taking a huge leap of faith of their quality of delivery down the line. So where I feel that a product team should be willing and proud to forecast for itself and at least deliver some range of expected impacts is in really validating that they're worth the budget and that what they're working on versus any variation of roadmap, whether delivered earlier or later, or let's polish this a bit more so it has an even higher impact. They're validating that their ideas for the roadmap are worth the budget that they should be getting. And that then ties right back to financial management of studios. And unfortunately, which is not a very fully understood practice for many game studios. And it's because it is very difficult to put a finger on what game design really will net in terms of monetization and cost uplift.
Mm-hmm. I want to dig into that just a little bit in terms of what you're saying. Russell Ovens came to mind again because product team says, "Hey, we got a great idea. We're going to do this. It's awesome. It's wonderful." And they build something. And do you launch it full scale? Do you do A/B testing? And A/B testing, by the way, as you'll know, if you read Russell Ovens' book, is much harder to do than you think. It's not simple. It's not easy, and it's actually easy to get wrong. And it's easy to fool yourself, and he's done it himself. So he's been there and he knows that. But you said there's multiple examples of like a product team bring something out and just really doing damage. And your game, your app is like a brand in somebody's brain, right? And they have an experience there, they have a feeling there, they're playing it. And when that gets violated, you have months and months of good vibes and good feelings and connection and engagement and retention, which manifests in engagement and retention. And then all of a sudden you do something and what the and somebody you can lose that instantly. You said you had too many examples to count. Do you have one of them top of mind?
As I was saying, and I think it's really important what you touch on there regarding A/B testing, because the approach taken by various studios to test, and constantly test becomes quite difficult to break down the results of. Sometimes you'll then have overlapping different A/B test variations that are running at the same time. They're running at different points in time of the player life cycle. And it can be pretty difficult then to actually figure out what is driving the needle here and where should we strategically have taken our game to begin with. I don't want to call out any bad practices out in the industry. And,
you're such a nice guy, and you're in Amsterdam. Come on, you're supposed to be Dutch and super controversial and out there. It's all good. I won't put you on the spot. No worries. Everybody's a potential future customer. I understand.
I do think a great example, and I do look at 2.5 Gamers a fair bit for great examples of just some thought leadership out there. And Jakub Remiar had a pretty good example of King really just testing out. It was a pretty minor change in Candy Crush that just made them completely take off monetization from that point onwards. And it was really just an incentivized, like, hey, spend a few credits to unlock a few more plays. And I'm probably completely butchering the example, but it was just a great example of something that seems so minor that you're testing it out. And you could even test it as a painted door experiment if you want to introduce like a new IAP, but just very small tests can result in huge uplifts. But important to just make sure you have a trackable way of seeing that those tests are actually resulting in the results you think they do.
Yes. That is more challenging than we would like it to be. Let's put it that way. Okay, let's talk about accuracy. So you talked about machine learning. I noticed you carefully didn't use the word artificial intelligence or AI, but we're in the ballpark there. But how accurate can you be with the forecasting, and what factors influence that accuracy?
I feel the artificial intelligence and AI nomenclature is one that I'm almost becoming the old man sitting on the lawn of like, get the hell off my lawn.
That AI washing, come on.
Because essentially
my AI startup is doing AI things to get your AI money so we can AI succeed. It's amazing.
Exactly. And I'll be happy when we're through this fad in a few years. I'm not saying that it's going to be a fad of just a few years. I know that AI will have deep and lasting effects throughout the industry, but at least we won't be constantly talking about AI features being the new hot thing.
This is my avatar talking to you right now. I'm not even here. I mean,
anyhow, so the very learning that we made from years of applying statistical regression was that at a certain point, it requires you to make leaps over and over and overrides of modeling that account for various sorts of events, that account for various sorts of live ops calendars, media mixes changing because, a certain market force pops in and buys out all the inventory. trying to sell super cheap toys from China. Like it's happened this year, and
Mhm,
it
mhm.
completely throws all the models around to a point where years back, we started testing with the neural networks and how applicable they would be to just learn themselves from previous trends and patterns in more data rich segments without necessarily overfitting for them. That's also something to watch out for. And where it's left us now is if you try to hold kind of a ceteris paribus, as much constant as you can. So accounting for media mix changes, accounting for UA strategy changes, accounting for product changes. You should hold as much as possible constant. You can get very, very close with a neural network based model,
Mhm.
especially when you model from the ground up from each individual segment. So not to toot our own horn, but that's the approach that we've taken. And it has taken us a painful path of learning to get there.
Which is super interesting because it's very similar to the types of things that marketers need to think about, UA pros need to think about when they're doing incrementality testing or when they're doing lift tests or other things like that. Or frankly, the very A/B tests that we were just chatting about, right? Everything is overdetermined. There are multiple variables and everything. Everything is always changing. You don't do user acquisition in a bubble. There are others spending and driving up. There's so many things going on there. So, yeah, I mean, the less you can have that impact your modeling, your cohorts, the better you can be. Now, can you put a number to it? Like when things are done, like not perfect. That we're not nobody's approaching perfection here, right? But when things are done reasonably well, the way that you want them implemented, how accurate can you be? Are you 80% accurate, 90% accurate, 99.9?
So we look at mean average percentage error as one of the key metrics for accuracy for our approach, and we are constantly back testing against what we forecast. So that
Mhm.
to put it very simply, essentially, if you say a quarter ago we had it forecast, if the model had just run on the data that it had up until that point, it would have forecasted X. And what historically happened against that, that's essentially that delta is then what we're looking at in terms of accuracy. And so a very small percentage in MAPI is great. And we're within the single digit range when we look at some of the key clients that we have. Some may have completely volatile models, and that's simply just a matter of how they monetize and their mix changes, and there's no real constant to hold.
Mhm.
But we're pretty proud of the confidence that we have on the median client.
Cool. Cool. Okay. So, let's say you're there and you've got single digit accuracy. So, you're close. What does that get you? What are you now able to do that you couldn't do before you had that?
Really great question. Um, this is where I do get to name it a name. It's not a client of ours, obviously, but one company that had the risk appetite to spend against a prediction rather than a realized LTV was Metacore. And they did that for I think a year or 2 years. They really spent against predicted LTV to the point where it then meant that they were aggressively spending on UA because they knew that if the product team were to realize on the predicted LTV uplift that they were promising, that these would back out. So essentially, at its
Mhm.
simplest, it's saying, I want 100% of my ROAS at a D365, but do you buy that at current LTV or do you buy that at predicted LTV? And that
Mm.
very difference means the difference between if you now 365 days later, if your LTV really is that higher mark, then you've left money on the table the entire way through, and your
Mhm.
competitors have been eating your lunch. So it's a differential on your growth trajectory as a game, and that's a very simple way to put it. There's impacts left and right of just good planning, and
Mhm.
any good plan is only worth its salt when it's executed. But there's a lot of teams that will say, well, a plan fails as soon as it makes first contact, but you
Yes.
have to make plans in order to actually know how much you should be spending, for instance.
Yes. There was some military leader, I forget who it is now, but said
Patent.
planning is
Yeah.
essential, plans are useless, right? And
Oh,
then
yeah.
some American military commander said plans fall apart on first contact with the enemy, something along those
That
lines.
one's Patton, and the other one's Eisenhower. If I'm not getting my strategists wrong
Yeah, I
right now.
think you're right. I
Yeah,
think you're
yeah,
right.
yeah.
Awesome. I'm super happy to have somebody on who knows those. That's really, really cool. Okay, cool. So if I unpack what you just said in your previous answer, what you're basically saying is, hey, you know what? We look back at the year we had and we're pretty happy. We grew 25% or something like that. But what you're saying is, you know what? If you had actually known the future and were more aggressive, you could have grown by 50%. And that delta, that gap, if somebody else grew into that gap, who knows if that gap is ever coming back? The world is always changing. New games are always being released. Who knows, right? You missed out on that and you may never get that back. Is that basically what you're saying?
You have, I know you have the idea, but you have no idea just how big that impact is. So actually, back 2016, early days of Candy Crush, cohort-based forecasting was the very reason that they went from a single digits million budget into a $400 million UA budget to grow Candy Crush to a $2 billion hit the same year. And it was purely the validation to do that gigantic spend, which I won't speak to where it was financed from, but it was validated that they should be spending that level of money in order to drive a completely outsized profit. That is the success story of Candy Crush. And that's why Candy Crush is what it is today. In part, obviously, the product team did absolutely amazingly. The King product team is, at the time, especially second to none. But the UA team needed to be able to validate growing that spend. And ultimately, it blew up to be one of the biggest games out there. It's
Amazing.
confidence, basically.
Amazing. I had it at a 2x differential. You had it at 100x and validated by history, right? That does, I mean, you talk about the financing. That is obviously a challenge. Like you can have all the forecasting data you want. If you don't have the capital to spend and your full recouping of your ad spend is 6 months out, 3 months out, 12 months out, whatever it is. Yeah, good luck. You can't spend what you don't have. And if you go to the bank, I mean, there are different financing options available. We know that for games, right? But if you go to some investor and say, my analysis says that, they may believe it. Somebody did for King, but it could be a tough sell.
No, exactly. And there's various partners now, but they are also quite rigorous as to the metrics that they want.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Excellent. This has been a ton of fun. This has been super interesting. I think we've covered pretty much what we wanted to cover. Is there anything else that we need to talk about?
I think if you want to see where the rubber meets the road, our mutual customer, Lotem, we wrote a case study about them a few months back. Really, it's the application of that confidence in forecasting that for them meant purely, we can cut out our unprofitable spend, we can find our profitable spend, or we can ramp it up with the confidence in our models to actually grow. And that opportunity is out there for so many different studios. And they use Singular as an MMP and they use Kohort for forecasting. So a happy bunch of guys.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Nathan, this has been great. It's Thanksgiving for our American cousins, but you're in Amsterdam. Doesn't matter for you. I'm in Canada. Doesn't matter for me. We're still working. It's wonderful though, because the lack of emails and Slack messages. Thanksgiving holiday is also a holiday for people who work with Americans. So happy Thanksgiving to them and great turkey dinner and all that stuff and wonderful shopping tomorrow. Who knows, all that stuff. Great chatting with you. Thank you so much for taking this time.
Likewise, John. Thank you so much for the time.